Okie dokie, period one. We're going to finish up the notes that we didn't quite finish in class, and you can see that I have copied and pasted the table of GPA and actual IQ for each of the 5 students in our study. Using the GPA and actual IQ, go to Staplet and enter the data. Then run the analysis. Calculate the correlation coefficient and the least squares regression line. So you can see that we have found our correlation coefficient, which is 0.936, and we found our R squared, the coefficient of determination, right here, and that is 0.877. And you may notice that's the same number that we got just a few minutes ago when we did the percent improvement between the new gal's mean regression line and the veteran college advisor that used the regression line with using IQ or GPA as a predictor of IQ. And then we also see that the S is given. This is the standard deviation, the residuals, and you may have noticed that we didn't see S when we did the regression on our calculators. So our S is 5.473, and this number we're going to compare with the 4.24 we found just a few minutes ago. And of course they are different values. Why are they different? The reason is when we calculate the standard deviation, we talked about, I don't know if you remember this or not, but we talked a little bit about degrees of freedom and the difference between when we have a standard deviation for a population and the standard deviation for a sample or a subset of the population. Well, this is very similar, but this time we have X data and Y data, so we actually have 2 degrees of freedom. So if we take our original 89.89 and instead of dividing by 5, divide by n minus 2, because we have 2 degrees of freedom because there's an X and a Y that can both vary, then you'll see that we'll get the 5.473 that we just got a minute ago, or very close to it anyway. Let's take a look at our box of important and big ideas. Our first learning target is about S, the standard deviation of the residuals. And while the calculator doesn't give it to us directly, we do have some steps that we can go through when we run the regression in the calculator that will allow us to get the value of S. And when you go onto Canvas to check your answers for the Check Your Understanding, I have the steps written out for you, so you can try it out with this data set, the body weight and backpack weight on the Check Your Understanding. Anyhow, many times we are asked to interpret the S value, and this is how we would do it. The actual, and then whatever the Y variable is in context, is typically about S, whatever that number is, away from the number that is predicted by the least squares regression line. Our next learning target is the coefficient of determination. And we are also often asked to interpret the R squared value. And although we can vary this just a little bit, we normally or typically say about R% of the variability in, and then whatever our context variable is for Y, for the response variable, is accounted for by the least squares regression line. And this means that while we see variation in the Y values, we know that they're not perfectly on the pattern, whatever our model happens to be, or our linear model. We know that there's variation in the real world data. And the R squared value is the percent of the variability that is included or accounted for by the least squares regression line. And then some of it is just because there's variability in data. So this is actually a measure of how closely our model, our regression line, is fitting to our data. So as I said, when you go online to Canvas to check your answers on the Check Your Understanding, I do have the steps written down, the calculator steps for question number 2, using your calculator to find and interpret S. What I recommend that you do is do all the rest of it except for the actual value of S right now before you go onto Canvas and check your answers. And then you'll see the steps and you can find the value of S. But you can actually write, you can do number 1 and number 3 and the interpretation of number 2 just without the number. All right, that's it for now. Go on and do your check your understanding, and I'll see you back in class.